Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie. Welcoming today in a moment, Kristina Biyad, the Outreach Director from the Foreign Policy for America Foundation, who will be speaking with us about a new report that she has produced based on her work around the country, looking at the connections between domestic and foreign policy. And Nick, I'm so excited to speak with Kristina because of our own outreach on this fall. I want to kind of tell our audience a little bit about it. We're back from Texas and going to Denver.
That's right. So we were hosted by the Bush School at Texas A&M. A great conversation there, which really, I think, gave us some food for thought about concerns about America's global engagement and how this ties into issues that they're facing in the Southwest, everything from migration to climate change to economic development and energy policy. And then this coming week, off to MSU Denver with a special focus on examining doorstep questions from the perspective of different communities and different groups that may lead to very different prescriptions for what America ought to be doing in the world based on where you live and what communities you belong to.
And now we're going to ask Kristina what she saw in Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Detroit, and Miami. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kristina. We are so excited to learn more about your report on Intermestic Policy Initiative, local perspectives on U.S. foreign policy, because it dovetails so closely with the work that we're doing here with the Doorstep in trying to understand what local communities need, want from our government, but also how they're connected globally. And your work in Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Detroit, and Miami is something that we want to hear about and talk about today. I want maybe you to set the stage because some of our audience may not have seen the report yet. So maybe kind of give us a little bit of background on how you came up with the concept and where it fits within the Foreign Policy for America Foundation, and kind of give us a lay of the land of when these interviews happen too. How recent are they, especially as we look ahead to an election year.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. Really a pleasure to be here with you both. So Foreign Policy for America Foundation, or Foreign Policy for America, our motto is that foreign policy starts here at home. And it's this idea that, Americans across the country need to be invested in the foreign policy that we're making and creating here in Washington, D.C. And about 4.5 years ago, when I stumbled upon Foreign Policy for America, we were a relatively new organization at the time. I was really, drawn into this idea that, foreign policy starts here at home. I've always, been in the foreign policy space, working overseas or with folks overseas, not necessarily thinking about how the work we were doing was impacting Americans across the country. And of course, it was a relatively politically charged time at the time. And I was really interested in understanding how we could, translate some of this stuff we were working on for Americans. So this idea that foreign policy starts here at home is really what, sparked the idea for us for the Intermestic project. And as we were trying to think about, how do we talk to Americans across the country about foreign policy issues? What issues should we focus on? We wanted to think, what are the issues that people care about? A lot of times people feel disconnected from U.S. foreign policy and the foreign policy establishment, and they're more focused on domestic issues. But we started to think about these issues that kind of cross-cut the traditional boundaries of foreign and domestic policy, which is where the word intermestic came from. So things like climate change, immigration, public health, things that are affecting local communities and feel a little bit more real for everyone. So we decided to set out across the country and have conversations with local stakeholders in those cities that you mentioned, to talk about those issues, understand how they were presenting themselves locally, and trying to understand, how they were thinking about these issues, and how they were impacting their communities and their lives. And we didn't force the issues on anyone, right? We didn't say we're going to talk about these 5 intermestic issues. I actually started off the conversations that we had with the very simple 2 questions. What keeps you up at night? Or what's an opportunity that you want to seize? That gave people a lot of space to share really the core issues that are impacting their community. And then we listened. We spent a lot of time listening to those answers and then trying to pull out some of those intermestic issues and start moving forward with the conversation. These conversations happened, between 2021 and 2022. They all started with us going out to these cities ourselves, sitting down locally with leaders, getting to know them, asking those types of questions that I mentioned. And the second half of it included some virtual roundtables where we connected a lot of those local leaders with DC-based policymakers working on each of those issues. I have to say, I'm really proud of Foreign Policy for America, kind of leading in this space and trying to understand the way that foreign policy impacts people across the country. And I'm really proud to be building a community of folks across the country who really want to engage on foreign policy. I think it makes our foreign policy stronger, and it makes our country safer if we start to build that foreign policy community that we need. That's really representative of local leaders across the country.
It's really interesting, the description you said of the choice of term intermestic. We had Nahal Tusi from Politico as one of our first guests on the Doorstep when we got started. And it seems to align with her concept of omni policy, right? That there are these issues that don't neatly fit into a domestic or foreign policy silo. So it's interesting to see that discussion is moving forward in many different areas. Is there a sense you've gotten from your conversations that in these cities, in these regions that you travel to, you had these listening sessions, these dialogues, you made these connections? Did you get a sense from people on the ground that they feel that these considerations are in fact being listened to in Washington, or that the Washington approach to foreign policy is going to be more informed by these local perspectives?
So that's a great question. I think, sadly, the answer is no. In the earlier, aspects of our conversation, the earlier time frame, people really, it took a lot of time for us to build trust and to establish ourselves locally, for local stakeholders to trust us enough to even come into a room. And now, it's on us to continue to hold their trust by delivering, by making sure that our colleagues here in DC are actually listening to some of these perspectives, are actively going out to connect with these communities and growing the project. So I think over time, I've seen their optimism grow of how much we're listening to those local perspectives. But early on, there really was a disconnect. I had a lot of folks say to me, this sounds great, thanks for reaching out, but nothing that I do is related to foreign policy, right? One example, a reverend in, I think it was outside of Dallas, I invited her to join the conversation, and she, told me, my work's not related to this at all, but meanwhile, she's working on anti-racism work and, racial equity and racial justice locally. And that's a really important aspect of US foreign policy, and having to kind of push people to say, hey, look, we want to build an anti-racist foreign policy, right? This is a part of it. We want you at the table. We want to hear your perspective, because people really didn't see the connection all the time. And they still feel like there's a disconnect from their everyday lives and what foreign policy decision makers are doing. But I do think we have a good shot at changing that if we, continue to listen to their perspectives and engage them.
I think it's so interesting, that, and I wonder if it is because the definition of foreign policy doesn't engage people, right? Or the term foreign just seems too foreign, because in your report, right, the concepts that you touch on, let's take immigration. Let's just take immigration. And I'm based in New York City, and all we talk about are the asylum seekers here. All we're talking about now, in fact, when I looked up Biden's work visas for thousands of Venezuelans, right, all the people that were covering it, from Milwaukee to Chicago to New York Post, were all local daily newspapers because it impacts our worker population in the city. So I wonder if there's also something more we can do to say, hey, maybe this is not foreign policy, or let's find a different word, because this is your neighbor or your employee, your potential employee, because there's a labor shortage. And that resonated through your report, that this idea that especially business leaders know that it impacts them, but also education and housing. I mean, it impacts every aspect of life here in New York City. We've been having protests because I don't think people understand that connection, which you do point out in the report, that the policies like sanctions that are made at the federal level really do impact the local level. And I'm wondering, as you think about your report and its impact and discussions, have you thought about redefining this idea of foreign, and that in fact it's not foreign at all?
Yeah, and that's why I really appreciate the word intermestic, and it it probably is not, it's not going to stick across the world. I'm not naive that we're going to have, people who are intermestic policy experts, but it's an important word for me for us to continue to use, because it just throws some of those definitions out the window, and we're talking about issues that just impact people's lives, right? If immigration impacts your local economy, it's a personal issue. It's a kitchen table issue, right? If they're connected to those day-to-day issues that are keeping you up at night, or standing in the way of different opportunities you want to seize, excuse me, those are kitchen table issues. Those are your day-to-day issues that you want to address. And I think, there's a lot. If we had all the time in the world and all the resources in the world, there were so many other issues that could have fallen in this category of intermestic, right? And there's so many sub issues within the broader ones that we explored, like misinformation and just cyber and tech more broadly, the rise of AI and the way that that's impacting education systems and raising your family. Those are all issues that we can't just address alone as the United States. They are global issues, but they're also kitchen table issues. They're also the things that are keeping people up at night. And I think as foreign policy experts or foreign policy makers, we want to make sure we're making that connection with people. We can continue to look at it as a global issue because we do have to work with the international community to address a lot of these issues, but we want to talk to people about it in a way that makes sense to them, in a localized way, in a domestic way, right? We don't want to talk about cybersecurity in the way we might at a think tank conversation. Talk about cybersecurity as keeping your grandma safe online, keeping your kids safe online, right? It's got to be about the core kitchen table issues, and then we can still look at it as a global issue that requires global solutions.
I mean, I think that is a great point, and really the kitchen table, the doorstep connectivities for these types of issues. I did want to ask you a bit about the Miami meetings that you've had, and Dallas as well. We just came back this past week from Carnegie Council Doorstep engagement that was hosted by the Bush School at Texas A&M. And something that I was really struck by was the sense that, if the U.S. Capitol was located in a different place than D.C., that you might have a different perspective. And that in Texas, and I assume the same thing you found this in Miami, these are the parts of the country which really engage with the larger Hispanosphere. They think much in terms of the U.S. Intricately interconnected with Latin America in a way that may not be the overarching perspective in Washington, which tends to think horizontally across the oceans rather than vertically. Is there a sense that you're getting from the work that you've been doing, and then with this report, that different parts of the country have different sort of foreign policy orientations in a way that U.S. foreign policy, instead of it being seen as at the country level, may in fact we need to be thinking about multiple U.S. foreign policies for different regions of the country?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really great question. And Miami and South Florida more broadly, and Dallas as well, are just very unique places. And I am so grateful for the local stakeholders that we've connected with there, because they've really helped us to understand those local nuances that you don't get when you're not from there, when you didn't spend a lot of time there. So if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have any of this knowledge. I just want to put that out there. But in Miami and South Florida, I'll start there. There's an incredible woman we've worked with out there, Evelyn Perez Verdia, and she runs a group called We Are Mas, and that's a group that focuses on or works with the Latin American diaspora in Miami and South Florida, and really across the world. And she says something I'm going to paraphrase. We can't wait for, or I'm sorry, she says two great things. I'm going to paraphrase. The one that I'll put here. She says that folks in the diaspora see U.S. foreign policy or U.S. policies through the lens of the country of their origin, where they come from, right? Whether it's their family that they grew up with here in the States or the country that they immigrated from. And that's a really important piece to understanding Florida politics and U.S. foreign policy in Florida. It's something that I think a lot of policymakers overlook. They're not having enough conversations with the diaspora to understand how some of even just the language we use to talk about different policies in the United States is just not translating for people. It's hitting people differently, and they're looking at it through a different lens. And we need to really understand dynamics of the different diasporas, especially in places like Dallas and South Florida, to be able to build a foreign policy that works for them. The other thing I'll say about South Florida is it's one place where you cannot disconnect the foreign and domestic. There are issues on their shores that are foreign policy issues here in DC that maybe we're overlooking, but they are affecting their day-to-day. Think about the trafficking of weapons from South Florida into Haiti, fueling gang violence, and then in turn pushing or increasing migration of Haitians to South Florida, right? That's an important issue, and you can't separate the foreign and domestic there for them because it's right on their shores. And same with Dallas. I think very similar to Miami, South Florida, we really have to be talking to the diaspora, understanding how they're thinking about foreign policy or U.S. policy through that lens of their country of origin. But it's also incredible how closely intertwined the economy is to, Mexico and South America. The Dallas economy and Texas economy more broadly is reliant on this, cooperation between the United States and Latin America. And local folks in Dallas feel the impact of that. That's a day-to-day issue. And that's something that, it does require some unique policies in Texas, or unique U.S. foreign policy in Texas, to ensure that the economies remain strong. It requires, unique U.S. foreign policy in South Florida to try and thwart the arms trafficking and the growing violence in Haiti. So I think you're right. I don't know the exact answer of what those U.S. foreign policies will be, but we need to talk to them, right? We need to at least understand, how is it impacting you? Okay, now how can we fix it?
I also think that, and what do you think of the idea that our representatives can do more? So, for example, in August, and it didn't get much attention, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez visited Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. Not much press, but those that covered this Latin America connection and new idea of how we engage with Latin America. And I wonder if there is an opportunity for our local representatives to do more to promote those links and to promote the idea, whether it's intermestic or omni policy, but the idea that the U.S. and needs to engage with the world because it impacts the kitchen table, your doorstep issues, and we, the representatives, when we speak about climate change or public health, we're also speaking to our impact on the world. And she's doing a little more of this in the last year or two than she did in the beginning. And I wonder if there is an opportunity, to engage the broader House what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for both locally elected officials and federally elected officials in the House and the Senate, in order to incentivize them to do that kind of travel, they need a constituency that wants them to, or at least sees the value of it. So there's a lot of great work being done on subnational diplomacy, and I talk about this throughout the report. Ambassador Nina Hashigian, who is the first special representative for subnational diplomacy in the State Department, trying to build out, international affairs bureaus, if you will, in mayor's offices and governor's offices. That's really important because it'll push a mayor to go to COP. It'll push a mayor to, go to the city summit that I was just at in Denver. It's an incredible convening of mayors and governors from across the Americas. But in order for a governor or a mayor to want to do that, or even, a member of Congress, they have to have their constituencies see the value of it. So what I'm trying to do through this work is to build a constituency of people who do see the connection of, their day-to-day with U.S. foreign policy. And they do want their locally elected officials to look into, global solutions to the climate crisis. They do want their locally elected officials to coordinate with mayors and governors in Latin America to address migration. If we don't have people, local leaders pushing for that, there's no incentive and it'll fall apart, right? A mayor's not going to move forward with an international affairs bureau in their office, or a deputy mayor of international affairs if no one wants it, right? They're going to then try and address what are the other issues that my constituents are saying they care about, and I'm going to focus on that. So until we build the support locally or in different districts or cities or states, I think local or elected officials more broadly are going to be, focusing on what their constituents want.
Is there something more the media can do? So as a journalist, I'm always asking the question, is it how people are getting information that maybe not driving, constituent demands in an area where they should be making connections?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure I know the exact right answer there, but I will say, local media has been incredibly supportive throughout this project, especially in Miami and South Florida, and just understanding the dynamics on the ground. So I don't know if there's a way that, at least from where I sit here in DC, we can better amplify some of these local journalists and local outlets to ensure that, the stories that they are writing about the issues impacting their communities get actually amplified to policymakers. I think that's one area we can be helpful. And one of the things I've started to do is I get my news from local outlets and try and understand, if I'm going to be working in those areas, what's impacting them. I think to the extent that, national outlets can coordinate with local journalists to amplify those stories, I think that would be very helpful. I think that the media can probably do more to celebrate some of the locally elected officials who are engaging in with the international community. I know the Denver City Summit got some coverage, but I definitely didn't see as much as some of the other big meetings that we see across the country. But that was a really incredible convening where you had governors, Republican and Democrat in the US, and across ideologies from Latin America and South and Central America coming together to just talk about what their people need and how they can cooperate. It's a great opportunity to highlight the different aspects of this work. And hopefully there will be future ones. So I'd say covering that more, trying to understand what elected officials are doing together, and then highlighting the voices of people in the community. I know local journalists do this relatively well, but the more that we can center people, real stakeholders, the folks who are living day to day in different communities, the better.
Yeah, I really want to pick up your point about the Denver summit, and of course the work that Nina Hachigian is doing. She came out of the Los Angeles mayor's office as a deputy. She'd been part of the Obama team in Washington. So she's moving back and forth, and I think trying to build these stakeholders. But it does seem that this disconnect is still there in terms of, as you said, coverage, that the Denver summit didn't get as much coverage as you might think it should have, given the importance of these topics. And it also seems that the DC community, foreign policy community, does still remain more outwardly focused rather than connecting inwardly, so that you don't get a lot of sense that our Asia, our Europe, our Africa, our Latin America experts that are based in Washington are traveling to different parts of the country where, as you said, these linkages exist. We start with diasporas, certainly. We look at places where there's economic and business relationships, and yet it doesn't. It seems that there's almost a mental block where people say, "I'd rather go to a summit in Brussels rather than go to Denver," because of the perception that that's where the real foreign policy issues happen. Are you seeing, as a result of the work Foreign Policy for America is doing, what the efforts of the Biden administration to make a connection, is this having any noticeable effect yet, or is it too early on reorienting people who work in the foreign policy community in Washington to think naturally about these, other parts of the country other than, the Washington to New York, Acela corridor as being places that they need to be engaged in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there has been some progress. I mean, the Biden administration and Jake Sullivan, especially with this idea of foreign policy for the middle class, and I mentioned this throughout the report. It really is groundbreaking in a lot of ways to just start thinking, even in small bits, how we can build our foreign policy to just work better for Americans. And that's the first step. And I mean, one of the examples I think I may have mentioned in the report is a global minimum tax credit that President Biden has pushed for. It's also another thing that I think probably didn't get enough coverage as it could have. But that was a huge move, right? It forces businesses to come back to the United States and employ Americans. It limits the ability for companies to go overseas and evade taxes, right? They're going to, if they're going to make money in the United States, they're going to pay their taxes in the United States. And that's a really important concept. And that's something President Biden led on because he's trying to deliver for Americans on foreign policy. And that's really important. And it bugs me that it didn't get enough coverage, but I think you can see it working, right? You can see a few people who are following and do see that they're excited and they're ready to do more and they're ready to work with local leaders. One of my fears is, we, in the foreign policy establishment, when we get excited about an idea, we don't always confirm that everyone else is excited about it across the country. And that's a problem. And, we can only go to 5 cities with this project. 5 cities is not the whole country. I did my best to be as representative of different regions that are usually not a part of the conversation and try and get as many community leaders as possible. But it's not enough. There has to be more. We have to understand how local leaders are thinking about these issues in order to do this better. So we don't want to get ahead of ourselves and say, okay, foreign policy for the middle class, we're here, we're doing it, everything's great, we're all on board. We got to get everyone else on board first. And then start to implement things. So I think there's a good number of folks in this foreign policy establishment who are on board, do see the value in doing this. They see that there is an overlap of our foreign policy and politics, and we do have to build a constituency for foreign policy, and we are making progress. But my fear is that we'll move too quickly without really understanding, okay, but what are the core issues? What are the kitchen table foreign policy issues? Okay, how do we now address those and build out this intermestic policy in a stronger way?
I think one of the through lines that I saw that I do want to highlight is the importance of looking at race and underrepresented communities as part of foreign policy. And I don't think really we hear enough of that talk at all, but the thread really came through on the Ukraine talk. And you mentioned you did these interviews in 21, 22, so people were already expressing reservations in US support because of the disparity in support of other countries. And that, listen, we're sitting in UNGA meetings this week here in New York, and we are still hearing the same narrative on Ukraine that seems dismissive of exactly what you're pointing out in your report, the idea that we can't just be focused on one country, that if we're going to do that, we need to make sure we have a strategy for other countries in need. And there were several examples in the report. And I wonder, how we can manage that, and what some recommendations were from the report. You had some that we can share with our constituents who are listening across the country. Our listeners are, and so I want them to also know that this is an issue that you highlighted, and that we're also looking at, always thinking about what communities are we reaching. That it's not just an educated, college educated community, right? Like we're in DC or New York. We really want to make sure we're listening across the spectrum. And I just want to mention in particular, because the middle class is shrinking here in the US, according to a Pew report, it's only 50%, right, of the population. And in fact, the lower income is up to 30% now. And so really, shouldn't it be a foreign policy for everyone? And I wonder if we need to change that language too, but that's a whole nother podcast episode. Maybe if we could just start out with this look at underrepresented communities, race, and narratives, and this idea of Ukraine as one example.
No, it's a great question. And I will say a very important aspect of this work, and really what brought me to it, there's not a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment who look like me, and that's a problem. And there's not a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment who come from backgrounds that I do, and that's a problem. And that's why we don't have these perspectives, and it's why we don't have enough people going out to seek them out. I'll point to one very specific line in the report from our conversations in Chicago, where someone who works with youth in the city on the South Side said that one kid came up to him and said, how can you talk to me about Ukraine when 63rd Street looks like Ukraine? That's a powerful question. That's an important question, and we need to be asking ourselves that. That is not to say that the United States should not be showing up for Ukrainians. That is not to say that U.S. support for Ukraine is not instrumental, because it is. And I have no doubt in that. And I will, defend the United States to continue to support Ukraine each and every day, because I recognize the risk of not. But not every American does, because their own house is falling apart. Their own lives are not going the way that they planned. They are at risk at home, and they're hearing their friends or neighbors or newscasters talk about Ukraine and talk about why the United States needs to support Ukraine. And they're going to the grocery store and they can't afford milk, or they're walking to school and, worried that someone's going to get shot. Right? Those are issues. Those are security issues for them that they're facing every day. And we can continue to deliver for Ukraine and for the international community and be a leader, but we have to deliver for our people as well. And you're right, it's foreign policy not just for the middle class, it's foreign policy for America, for all Americans who look like me, who look like you, who look like all of us, right? In communities across the country. And if we're not, as policymakers, and if elected officials are not delivering for those communities, we're not going to have the support to continue to do what we're doing overseas. And the reality is that we can do both. We can deliver for our communities at home, and we can deliver on foreign policy priorities abroad, but we need to do both, and we need to show folks that we're doing both, and that we don't have to sacrifice one for the other.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great point to end on. We look forward to continuing to read your research and to support your work. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.